Hello, and welcome to Impacto AZ, a podcast dedicated to centering the Latina, Latino, and Latine voice on the important issues of the day. I'm your host, Jonathan Higuera, here along with my co host, Juan Rodriguez. Today, we are delving into the life and legacy of the late Susan Carroll, a journalist whose stories changed many people's lives for the better. Her style of journalism was what you would call old school and vital to a functioning democracy. Her pieces exposed wrongdoing, shined a light on financial malfeasance with public monies, and of course, humanized the suffering. I'm sure her body of work makes her parents and especially her Cuban mother proud. My guests here today to help us memorialize Susan are Joseph Garcia, Susan's city editor during the start of her career at the Tucson Citizen, and also one of her journalism professors at the University of Arizona. Also with us is Daniel Gonzalez, a colleague of Susan's when she worked at the Arizona Republic, where the two teamed up on immigration stories from time to time. And Diana Didi Fuentes, the executive director of the Investigative Reporters and Editors Organization, which has trained countless journalists on how to better carry out their craft. IRE recently established a fellowship in Susan's name that will allow many journalists to attend IRE conferences and training programs. So let's start there. Diana, tell us more about this fellowship and how it came to be and how it will be used.
Susan joined IRE in 2002. She was very active with us. She knew a lot about how we got started. Our name IRE actually was purposely chosen, although we are about investigative reporters and editors. That's quite right. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and sadly, without her, she died by suicide, and her family wanted to know that because they figure mental health awareness is very important. And we lost her in May of 2024. We have created a fellowship in her name. Her friends and family and her workers created it. We've raised $25,000 for it, and we're still accepting donations in that. People will be able to attend the conference in her name. That's one of the big networking thing that we do. We investigate. That's what we do. We're not advocates except for First Amendment rights, for the rights of journalists and all. But Susan was always a big advocate, and that's what people remember her by. She cared a lot about her family, her friends, about fellow journalists. She was everything. I know we'll get really into this sort of thing, but this fellowship is going to help people attend the conference, and that's where she met her husband to be, and it was always something for her to share what she knew. IRE is all about sharing. You will find people that on our listservs, for example, people want to pass it on as much as even back then. It was in the Watergate days when we got started. Exclusivity was important. People always fight, right? Everybody wants to be first. But one of the biggest things that IRE did was we were always willing to share ideas, willing to share tools. Collaboration, which is a big deal now, has always been important to IRE. When it all came down to it, we knew that we were always up against corruption, power, and that what was very important was to make sure the public stayed informed. And if that meant working with each other, that's what it was going to be. And that's what Susan knew.
That really does sound like her. I mean, even from her early days when I knew her and worked with her at the Tucson Citizen, she always cared for her fellow reporters and editors and colleagues in a way that, sometimes it's a fast-paced profession and it's
Yeah.
hard to do all things, be all things to all people, but she really did have that spark to her.
Yeah,
Um,
there's lots of people who want to run over each other, and she was not like that. I want to make a point there. There's always those people that want to get ahead by stepping on somebody. That was not Susan. She got ahead because she knew what she was doing, but because she always brought someone up with her. And I want to make that's important.
that
Very
is starting to emerge in my research of going back into her career. You're seeing that repeated over and over. And before we go any further, I just want to say that these three guests have long and storied careers in journalism. So while some of them might not be performing journalism today, although I know Daniel is and Deanna's heavily involved in IRE, but even Joe had a great career working in Arizona, not only at the Tucson Citizen, but the Arizona Republic and for Gannett. So as the conversation evolves, I hope you guys can mention some of your your accomplishments there too, because I think it's important for our viewers to know. So now, Joe, you were a journalism professor of Susan's as well as her first city editor in a after college job. What are some of your remembrances of Susan, maybe starting from as a student and progressing to as a young journalist?
Yeah, as a longtime journalism adjunct professor at University of Arizona and then later at Arizona State University, you get to see people that come in, and out of every room you hope that there is a shining star, and that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be some late bloomers and some people who really learn, and they understand the craft and they want to learn as much as possible. Susan had a immediate spark because she had, well, she had what I think are the three C's that you need to be a great journalist. One is the competency. She understood the craft. She crafted every story well. Uh, Curiosity, I think, which is something that actually needs to be taught more and more these days, because I think there is a not as natural curiosity as there was years and years ago, because we're bombarded with so much information now. I mean, it just
Well,
comes
we're
to us.
more of a curator now, it seems
Yeah,
like, than being curious, right?
and compassion. I think Susan had a lot of compassion for people, and I think part of that is because she understood people's struggles. Um, an ego, I would say she took pride in her stories, but she was not a prideful person. She wanted the stories to have an impact, and they always did. She didn't believe in hitting people over the head as much as she believed uh, reaching them in their mind and and them understanding something that they wouldn't know otherwise. So I identified Susan very early on as somebody that wanted to hire her out of college, of course, and we were blessed to have her at the Tucson Citizen, and I supported her when she went on to the Arizona Republic and beyond that. I've always supported her. We keep in touch because to Susan, I think the connection with people was so important to her, and she was always the same Susan to me.
Okay.
She has that infectious laugh. Her smile could light up a room. But I also saw another side of Susan because I worked so closely with her when she would do stories such as immigrant deaths in the desert and how horrible they were. And the Tucson sector, especially, was suffering and still does from too many deaths of people just dying in the desert, most horrible deaths, and just coming across the border trying to find a better life. And those kind of stories, and she has a whole career of covering a lot of heartbreaking stories. They do take a toll on you. And I know in journalism we have what we call gallows humor, is where it's a coping mechanism that we have, a defense mechanism where we kind of joke about everything and so forth. She was never like that. She never got into the gallows humor, and I think really tough stories. I mean, they all affected her. They all impacted her. And I would go in sometimes on a Saturday or a Sunday, and she was at the keyboard working on a story, a longer story, an in-depth story. And she had a great eye for detail, but just as important, she had a heart for humanity, and she was she was one of those rare journalists, quite frankly, that was both a good writer and a good reporter. You don't
Okay.
always get that combination, and I would say
Right.
she was A plus in both. So, for Susan, she was small. She's diminutive in size, very slight in build. She was a small person, but I'm telling you, the presence that she gave out, uh, and the presence that she had in a story. I thought it could fill a room, it could fill your mind, it could change your mind. You could understand a situation, and the people that she wrote about and reported on, and um, those people came to life
In her
before your
stories,
eyes, and she
exactly.
made sure that they were represented. So
And I do want to come back to
Yeah.
Down the road a little bit here in the show, what attracted you? What you made her her first hire at the Tucson Citizen? Am I correct?
Easy. That was an easy job, John.
Yeah,
I'll just tell you. Don't
I
spend
want to
too much
get to
time on that. It
some of the
wasn't like
stories that
I discovered a rare a
yes.
gem and I turned it into a diamond. Susan came to me as a diamond. I mean,
Yeah,
quite frankly.
right. Okay. Now, Juan, did you have a question for Daniel?
Well, you mentioned that she came already a diamond. While she was there, when did you realize that you were right in hiring her, and when did she start demonstrating to you that that she was a great hire and the quality of work? When did that start coming through?
You're asking me one?
Yes.
Uh, um, well, it was immediate. I mean, the truth is, if you teach journalism or you've been in a newsroom for a while, so forth, you immediately can identify somebody. So it wasn't hard on that sense. I think one of Susan's strongest attributes, though, is that she was able to take direction. She was able to receive constructive criticism. She was okay if you rewrote something as if you could explain it to her and why you were doing it this way. She was a constant student of the craft, and she never let her ego get in the way of growing. And I think that, and we're all guilty of this, I think, in life and all whatever trades we may have, is sometimes we think we're a finished product and we know it all and we're very good and we're accomplished. She was never like that. She was always learning. She was always looking for ways to do better. She was always looking at ways to improve. And for me, that was the big plus, is that, yes, I saw a diamond, but also the way she was received is she wants to be even a better diamond, a better class of diamond that would illuminate everybody with truth and humanity. And those two
Okay.
things, I think, drove her career.
And
Speaking of
but
a
can I mention
diamond, go
real
ahead.
quick? I was just going to say,
Yes.
because I want to point out that she kept wanting to learn. Even when she won big prizes, when Hurricane Harvey came, she was the leader of the investigative team. And she didn't have to go in and do breaking news, but she made arrangements for her boys to get her sons to be taken care of. And she went into the newsroom and she pitched in with the regular rank and file to be reporting when all the storms were hitting. She didn't have to do that, but she wanted to be part of the team that did the grunt work, and
Right.
that was her. She
Yeah.
wanted to be part of it and help out, and I mean that was important. And of
I
course,
loved
she
it
went
when
on
that
to do it.
generation had ink in their veins,
Yes,
right?
yes,
You
and
talk
she
about
could
it,
have
the older
kept going.
generation had ink, but she was
Exactly. I
newer
just wanted to
generation who
say
had
that.
ink in her veins.
Yeah, she kept growing the whole life
Yes.
through. She kept doing that. Sorry, it just rung
No,
out
no,
with what
that's
you
good.
were
That's good
saying.
addition. Let's talk a little bit about some of those stories. And I know, Daniel, you worked with her closely on some projects at the Arizona Republic. What were some of the more memorable projects that you remember either working with her on or that she did herself? What are some of your recollections, Daniel?
Well, first of all, when Susan came to the Arizona Republic, she was probably still only in her mid 20s. But I remember she had already won um, the Arizona Journalist of the Year at the Tucson Citizen. So she came as people were wondering, like, well, who's this, young woman only in her 20s who had already been named uh, Arizona Journalist of the Year from the Arizona Press Club. And when she came here, she continued on her kind of legacy that she was starting at the Tucson Citizen, which was covering border issues and immigration. I think in the beginning, when Susan came here, she was based out of Tucson, covering the border. And one of the stories that we worked on was a story looking at every single person who had died in a specific year crossing the border. And just to kind of set the context here, in the early 2000s, immigration in Arizona was really a new phenomenon. Most illegal immigration up until then had been taking place in the El Paso area of of Texas, and in the San Diego area of California. And both of those areas began to be fortified by the government with the feeling that migrants would not cross through Arizona because it was so inhospitable, so rugged, so dangerous. And that's actually not what happened. There were the collapse of the peso in Mexico and the booming economy in the United States created this massive flow of undocumented people through Arizona beginning in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which is when Susan was beginning her career as a journalist. And she was one of the first journalists to recognize this emerging phenomenon, not only of undocumented migration through Arizona, but the terrible toll, human toll that it was playing on immigrants who were crossing. Prior to that, maybe one or two people would die a year in Arizona, if any. And we saw that number skyrocket in the early 2000s, where as many as 200 to 300 people were dying every year crossing the Arizona desert. So she was one of the first journalists to really recognize that emerging phenomenon and really seize it. The other thing is that up until then, most journalists were reporting the numbers, how this was leading this, there was this record number of people dying through the desert and this phenomenal flow of migrants coming through Arizona. And what she wanted to do was really personalize the people who were dying, which was very, very difficult to do because nobody really knew who these people were. Lots of times, all that was found in the desert were their remains. And you can imagine in Arizona, under the horrible, harsh conditions, within a matter of months, a human body would be reduced only to skeletal remains. So the big project that I worked on with Susan was trying to humanize all the people who had died in one specific year. And we did that, and was completely Susan's idea. We did that by through a public records request, getting all of the autopsy reports for every single person that died in a specific year. And I can't remember what year it was. It would have been in the mid 2000s. And then what we did is we combed through all of those records looking for specific details that would bring those migrants to life. Sometimes many of the migrants that were found, they had no names. Nobody knew who they were, and they would be buried in unmarked graves in Tucson. So, but what was known about them was the things that they were carrying, things like a hairbrush, a photograph, the type of clothing, their jeans, a blouse, a hairpin, all those little details that were included in the autopsy reports. So that's what we did. We took the 200 and some people who died that year, and we built a small profile of every single person. And the people that we could name, we named, and the people that we couldn't name, we would include those details that were able to be found so that every single person who died crossing the desert that year had some kind of humanity brought to them so that the readers
What a
were no
marvelous.
longer numbers, but actual people. Now, that was
Okay.
the one big project that I remember working on with Susan.
And that one was an attention getter. I remember a lot of people started paying much more attention to what was going on along the border and the deaths that were resulting in the injuries. And we're going to keep talking, but I'm going to go ahead and share a little slideshow so our viewers can actually see Susan while we're talking about her. So that was a big project, Daniel, and I do recall that. I don't know if I was at the Republic then too, but she kind of started on that path while at the Citizen and some of the immigration stories she was working on there. By the way, I was Susan's first journalism professor at the University of Arizona. I don't remember the year, but it was Journalism 201. And at that point, she wasn't completely convinced she was going to be a journalist. She was still exploring her options, but she clearly had some talent right out of the gate. And I'm so glad she took to journalism. And then I worked with her again at the Citizen. But in looking at some of the research on her, it just seems like maybe when she made the move from the Republic to the Houston Chronicle, where she worked for 14 years, her career went to another level, as if she didn't already have enough accolades that she could have comfortably stayed at the Arizona Republic. After all, I think she grew up in Paradise Valley here in the Metro Phoenix area. She had enough respect and enough going for her. She didn't have to make that move to Houston, but it did seem to me, just going through the research, that it really even gave her even a higher profile and gave her many more stories to pursue. Um, like covering Hurricane Harvey, organizing coverage for Hurricane Harvey, like some more immigration stuff where she went down to Honduras and tracked down people and MS-13 gang members, just different things that she did there. Deanna, can you speak to any more of her work there in Texas?
She was fearless. The woman was fearless, and she was, as I mentioned earlier, compassionate. Right? I think Joe mentioned that that her compassion, especially for children. You mentioned, of course, the immigration, and Daniel was talking about how the point that they wanted to make about humanity. She was very concerned. She did an excellent story, a big investigation piece on the plight of the unaccompanied minors that were abused in the federal, supposed to be the migrant shelters where they were supposed to be safe. But in fact, there was a lot of abuse going on, both emotional and sexual and physical abuse. And she wrote at a time when no other reporters were paying attention to these unaccompanied minors traveling alone during these terrible times. She won awards for that, and a lot of attention was brought, and some changes were made. Another case that she wrote about that again was difficult for her because she internalized a lot of this stuff, but she felt very strongly that the word had to get out. These cases where parents who accidentally killed their own children while backing up their cars, which you think happens just every now and then, but actually happens a lot more often than you realize. And her series brought about changes in federal rules that now require backup cameras. And it made changes. And
Wow.
so she was proud of that, sad about the things why it had to happen. But those were the kind of things that she cared about. Those things made a big difference.
And, and
She
those are
got
the
into
things we
editing,
go into journalism and dream about doing, right? I mean,
making a
that's the
big
kind of
difference.
stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she wasn't big on bragging, not about herself. But if you look at her posts, she was always big on bragging on her fellows, on her colleagues and what they would do. But it was important for her. She did big stories. I remember one, people talked about still, the massive chemical plants in Houston, the toxic waste that comes out of there. She wrote a lot about those stockpiles that were coming out, and mismanagement of the public schools, again, about children, but a lot to do with the $44 billion public school endowment that is what funds Texas schools. And she went into that, sure, that's part of IRE, right? The data part of it. We're big into data analysis, and she was very good at that. The woman was smart, 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 smart. And that was a big deal. But she was always a caring person. And she was always looking for the human part of the story. How did it matter? Why should you care? And she made you care. She made you care.
And what I'm thinking right now, sorry to interrupt, but I'm thinking, she did all this. She kept her eyes on the prize during a time when the newspaper industry was roiling, right? The
Yeah.
changes that must have gone on during her time. And even Daniel, you must have experienced this too, trying to keep your focus on your journalistic storytelling and chops intact at a time when the industry is going through some major changes, right? Reduction in staff, people getting their news elsewhere. I don't know, Daniel, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, what it's like to be in a newsroom when change is all around you, and even how people are consuming their news, and how do you keep your focus? By the way, Daniel won a Pulitzer Prize along with his team for their coverage of the wall. What year was that, Daniel? 2017?
2018.
2018, right, right. So maybe you can give us a glimpse of what it's like to stay focused during these tough times, and we get a sense of what Susan was experiencing as she worked through this too.
Well, as everybody knows, journalism has become a very kind of fractured environment, and we've seen that here at the Arizona Republic, where when I started here and when you were here, we had a newsroom of over 500 people, and we covered, every square inch of our state. And now our staff has been reduced to around 100 people, so it's quite a bit smaller. And there is a lot of changes, and it's very unsettling when you see colleagues leaving, especially experienced colleagues, and you see your staff, getting smaller and smaller, and this our staff has been reduced at a time when our population has boomed. So it means we have more and more people living in our state and few journalists. But I mean, in terms of staying focused, I mean, I think one thing I think people continue to be is very passionate about the importance of journalism, and it's more important than ever. And I see that same kind of passion, whether it's journalists who have been here for a long time or people who are new. It's Journalism has always attracted a unique kind of person, people who are very passionate about seeking the truth and telling stories and presenting that to the public. And so I'm encouraged by the passion that I still see coming through the newsrooms, and by the many young colleagues that I see that we're surrounded by. But also, I mean, I think the other thing is, though, although newsrooms have gotten smaller, there's a lot more options for journalism to tell stories. You just look at your podcast. There's many journalists that I've seen who have left kind of the legacy media and are finding new pathways forward in the new media. And I think that's also is exciting to see all the different ways that news now is delivered to
And we do
people.
know that Susan eventually left the Houston Chronicle and went to ProPublica, right, where she was on a investigations team. I don't know if she was an editor or reporter at that point, and then from there she moved on to NBC News Digital. Diana, do you recall any of
Yes.
her?
Yes, the NBC News in particular, one of the big things that she did right before her death, she was working on a story with her colleagues at NBC about unclaimed bodies for medical research, Dealing the Dead, I think is what it was called. As a matter of fact, that won a George Polk Award, and it came and other awards. It was a big deal, and that one came. The cash prizes from that, her colleagues donated to the endowment
Oh,
to
okay.
ensure that her work would continue, specifically for that reason. But both at ProPublica and at NBC News, again, exactly what you're saying, what Daniel was saying. She knew that the world was changing, but for her, the basics were still there. The investigative part was what was necessary. The bringing information to light for the public to see, that she wanted to make sure the public was informed and that voices needed to be heard. That was Susan.
That's what drove her,
There
huh?
were voices out there that needed to be heard. People, that was when I knew her. She was bilingual. We used to speak in Spanish. I didn't know her as well as other people did, but I remember talking to her when IRE had Border. We used to have Border, a series in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I was in Laredo. I was the editor of the Laredo Morning Times, and IRE brought these series down there, and we were collaborative internationally then. And her thing was, like I said, she was fearless. There was a lot of stuff going on. The cartels were active. They always seem to be active, but sometimes they're more active than others. And she was just down there. I mean, they were, and we were always very careful in that. We opened the doors to our big competitors,
Hmm.
but because it was important. I know there's always some competition and all that, but we always felt very strongly. Us on the border, we're small, right? We're community papers for the most part. We do breaking news, so we open the doors to our big colleagues to come do the investigative pieces. We can help you with the sources, and, we'll run your pieces, we're share kind of things. And Susan, and not everybody's like that. Some people like to
Hmm.
Bigfoot it anyway, or they ignore you, right? Because who are you, little people? But Susan was never like that. Susan was
Okay.
always big-hearted, and she always wanted to share, and she was willing to listen, and she was just, her thing was, we need to get the truth. The truth is important.
And
And
I'm sitting here wondering if this dedication that she had, and we all know it. I know I worked on some project with her where we were up all night editing it, right? Going home when the sun's coming up. I didn't do it as much as she did, that's for sure. But it can take a toll on you, right? Susan was such a family-oriented person, yet she had this. There's a stress to being in this newsroom environment and this responsibility to always be looking for the next great story. And I wonder if that contributed to the mental health situation. that ultimately led to her untimely death. But I don't know, Daniel, can you speak a little bit to stress and mental health and how journalists can better take care of themselves?
Yeah, well, as you know, Jonathan, when we were growing up, journalism has always been a very stressful job. And as Diana pointed out, you tend to internalize a lot of the trauma and second hand trauma that journalists are exposed to. If you're a journalist for any amount of time, you're going to be exposed to trauma and secondhand trauma. And but I think what I'm happy to see is that more and more people are in newsrooms are addressing that and speaking more open about it. I don't think it happens enough. Personally, I have seen over a career of over 40 years a lot of very, very horrible things. I've seen dead people. I've covering immigration and migration. I've traveled extensively through Mexico and Central America. I just came back from an extensive trip in Panama and to the border of Guatemala and Mexico. And you see and hear a lot of very, very horrible stories firsthand. I've suffered from insomnia for years. I wake up almost every single night and can't go back to sleep. I'm haunted by horrible things that I've heard and seen. I'm scared many times. I keep my house very secure and locked because of some of the stories that I write. And I always tell young journalists when I meet them that to be aware of the mental health challenges that journalists faced and don't try to brush them off. Don't try to hide from them and try to talk about them. I've sought out counseling through my work so that to help me deal with some of my insomnia issues, stress issues, anxiety issues that are directly related to my job. So I think it's I was glad to hear that Diana pointed out the manner of death early on, and that her family wanted people to be aware of of that, because journalism, very much like first responders, like the police and firefighters who are exposed to things every day, um, journalists face that kind of trauma as well, but it's often ignored by newsrooms, and there is no way, no, unlike police and firefighters, where there's often debriefings and mental health counseling and encouragement of that doesn't take place enough, in my opinion, in newsrooms. So
Okay.
I think
Agreed.
Susan's great legacy as a journalist, but also the manner of her dies and the way she died, is an opportunity to continue to talk about these issues and bring them to light.
I
Okay.
totally agree with Daniel. Lisa Olson, who's a colleague of Susan's at Susie's over at the Houston Chronicle, she led the charge for the fellowship endowment, and she talks about that she thinks Susan would want us to confront the fact that this happened to her, that she committed suicide, and she does think that the journalism, what she saw, the things that she experienced, had to have something to do with this. Just what Daniel says, we grew up in a time when nobody talked about that sort of thing. We went and we covered and we saw horrible things, and as part of our work, and nobody told us anything about what we were supposed to do with that. We
Mhm.
either went to the bar, or we all got together at the end of the day and had a drink, and well, a bunch of us ended up alcoholics or ended up just like that. Nobody ever talked about it. I very much admire the young people of today who try to do work-life balance, who look for this kind of help, and I very much support that. But it's still, Daniel, there's not enough of it, I think. We at IRE offer these sessions, and DART, which is now working with one of the universities, and Bruce Shapiro and his people are still doing this. But I think that all of us need to encourage it as much as we can with the young folk, because we want them to keep doing it, right? We know that journalism is changing, but all it is changing its format, because the public still needs to be informed. So we need to make sure that there's good people out there that are in good health to do this. And it's hard. It is hard.
It is. It's a
You know,
challenging profession.
it is very challenging. All of you know that.
I'm so
Like
glad we're
Daniel,
aware.
yeah, I've been through a lot of that, and in Waco, and that's what I did. We used to call it death and destruction, which I'm sure is totally
Hmm.
not a politically correct thing to say these days, but that's was my beat.
Other
And
sayings, if it bleeds, it leads, those
exactly.
kinds of things. But
Yeah.
this has been a wonderful conversation. I didn't want that really sheds light on Susan's commitment, passion, and skill in executing these kinds of stories. And it's made our democracy stronger. It's given everyday folks a chance to perhaps not experience some tragedy that they may have otherwise experienced. And we couldn't have had this remembrance without you folks who worked with her. Joe had to sign off early, but I'm glad he was able to talk a little bit about his relationship with Susan and what he knew, his remembrances. And with that, unless anyone else any final thoughts, I think we're going to wind this show up.
Would I mention one quick thing, just
Yes.
because having studied some of these mental health things, that if anyone is struggling with thoughts of suicide, that they can text 988 for help.
988
If you
for
know
help.
someone who needs help and you don't know what to do to help them, try texting or dial 988.
Okay. With that, I'll say thank you for tuning in to watch Impacto AZ. Our channel now is up to 5 videos. We hope you like and subscribe so we can continue giving you this type of information with this high quality of guests. And with that, I just want to say thank you once more to my guests, and hopefully we'll have you on the show again sometime. Take care.